Dave, what happened to Sting and his position in the company as Hogan, Savage, Piper, Hall, Nash all flood in? Was he sort of knocked down a peg from the Sting we were talking about back in, 90, 91, 92?
He was moved to the side. I wouldn't say he was moved down because they always protected him. For the most part. I mean, I think there was a period before he started doing the new gimmick. There was a period where he was kind of he was always one of the top guys, though. I don't think they ever really moved him down. But when they had those guys come in, he was still kind of the babyface leader, I think, or one of them with Savage and Luger, and it was a group. And then when he started doing the new gimmick, that's when they were kind of grooming him for a real top position.
And he got there, and it was a box office smash, and it was pretty much the biggest night in WCW history. Starrcade 97 in Washington, D.C. He faces Hulk Hogan. Dave, what was the right finish on this night?
The right finish was Sting beating Hogan in a dynamic way. That's the only finish they could have done after all that buildup, and it had to be a changing of the guard to a degree, and they did none of that. Even with Sting winning, with the idea that they had of Sting winning wasn't the worst, but the follow up he needed to be stronger, and they needed to get away from the idea that Hogan dominated everything for a little while, and I think that one of the problems with the whole thing is they were building Sting up for this big thing, but at the end of the day, they were never going to go away from Hogan. I mean, Bischoff just felt that Hogan was the guy. And I can't say, he was wrong, but there's a time limit on everything. And that's the problem, is that I don't think that Bischoff saw the time limit, that Hogan couldn't be on top in that heel role forever. And I don't think that he realized that. And I think that it wasn't so much the night and the way he won, which wasn't good at all. But it was the follow-up that was the killer, I think. Because in the follow-up, he just became another guy. And he wasn't that great to where being another guy, some guys can be booked as just another guy, and they're so great they can overcome it. Sting, he faded really quick if you really look at it. I mean, he was like on that Starrcade, he was like the biggest thing in WCW after that build-up. And then within a couple of months, I mean, he was so far behind Bill Goldberg, it wasn't even funny, fairly quickly.
Yeah, and in fact dropped the title in April of 1998. That's how short-lived what should have been this historic storyline capping title run ended up being, as circumstances played out. Now, what is the story? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors, of course. I'm sure we don't know every last little detail of what went on that night. But what is the story about how the false cover of Hogan with Nick Patrick, not counting fast, but counting at a normal cadence, ended up hitting the ring? What do we know as we sit today?
I think Nick Patrick has done interviews where he's pretty much admitted that Hogan told him not to do it. Mm-hmm. And so he said that I could listen to Bischoff or I could listen to Hogan, and I thought Hogan was the one with more stroke. So that was it. And yeah, it just was and that was a disaster.
It certainly was. It was the air out of the balloon. They went ahead and did the finish anyway, with the Scorpion. He points to Bret Hart. He gets the belt. Great post-match celebration as the WCW locker room fills the ring. And you're just left wondering, Dave, why couldn't they just do that? Why this interruption, this little allowance for a Hulk Hogan visual pinfall? And the only thing that makes sense...
I mean, the idea was that it would be a screw job, and Bret Hart would be there to rectify the screw job since he had just been screwed. It really did make sense, the idea, but the execution of what they did was tremendously bad. And I'm not saying the idea was the greatest, but it could have been okay. But once you didn't have the fast count, I mean, like if he had gone in there and Sting would have kicked out at 1, and the referee would have counted 2, 3, or there just would have been, which probably would have been the best way to do it. But instead, like the referee counted 3 at a normal pace, and Sting didn't kick out. I think that Sting just thought that it was going to be a quick 3, and it wasn't. So that that the thought process on the Sting side, or on the people who worked with Sting, I don't think they really thought the whole thing through that well.
Now, do you think that Sting, in retrospect, because Bischoff talked a little bit about this in his book and in some interviews, that Sting kind of kept Hogan kind of at arm's length in terms of dealings, was actually quite kind of shook by the idea of, going in there with Hogan and trying to maintain his stature vis-a-vis Hogan. There are these stories about how Sting didn't show up in what Hogan and Bischoff considered satisfactory shape. They made a deal about the fact that he didn't have a tan and he wasn't muscular and all this. Do you think Sting was kind of like naive in this scenario, self-aware, taken for a ride?
Um, there's so many weird things that were going on. All of that was true in the sense that he could have come back in better shape. At the same time, it really didn't matter. They still could have done what they should have done. And any excuse not to was not a good excuse at that point. I mean, because Sting was like that for the whole year anyway. It was like the people were buying it. It was a fantasy. And I mean, like the match itself, it was not a good match. That was on both of them really. Um, but Hogan took way too much offense. Because Hogan took the match, did the leg drop, had the rep. I mean, he basically outworked Sting, but it was for the detriment of the company. It was for the detriment of Hogan because while they did have another really good year because of Bill Goldberg, if it wasn't for Bill Goldberg, I think they'd have gone down a lot quicker. And Hogan was cutting his own throat by cutting his leading rival off at that time. I'm sure that Hogan in his own mind was probably going like, I'm going to go babyface anyway. And perhaps, I mean, the key was that when he goes babyface, he didn't want Sting to be at his level because Sting would have been a challenge for the top babyface spot.
Certainly. Now, one other instance we see that might indicate a fissure that will create difficulty for WCW is Kevin Nash not showing up that night to work the Giant and the scheduled job, I believe, to the Giant that night.
Right. And Scott, then he came back on the next pay-per-view and beat the Giant.
Dumped him on his head, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, which basically tells you all you needed to know about WCW at that point in time. That you, whether it was an excuse, whatever this thing was, avoiding doing the job on the first one. If anything, he should have had to do the job twice to prove that that his excuse was legit. Instead, he got to go over, and at that point, it was kind of like that told you that he could get away with anything he wanted, and he knew it. And once he knew it, he pushed for all he could get.
Yeah, that kind of represented an opening for Kevin Nash, and we would see him sort of branch out politically, really as his own force, all the way to getting his hands on the book and ending the streak, as we'll talk about. Did you get the sense around this time, Dave, or as soon as Kevin Nash walked in the door at WCW, that he was going to try to be a political player on par with Hogan in terms of sway backstage?
I think that I kind of figured that before he ever got there because he was in WWE or WWF. So there was no reason to think that he would change. He was always, he was a really good manipulator. So he was going to become a manipulator there no matter what. And there, I think he had a lot more stroke because at the end of the day in WWF, you can manipulate Vince McMahon to a degree, but Vince McMahon is still, Vince McMahon had good business sense. And I don't think that in WCW, there were so many people, and I don't know that any of them had that good a business sense so they could be manipulated a lot easier. And I think, Nash was very charming and everything like that. So that helped. But Vince, like if it wasn't working, especially in the 90s, if it wasn't working, because the company wasn't in a situation where it was like instant making money like it is today. I mean, in the 90s, if the company didn't do well, they lost money. And that Vince was losing his own money. It wasn't a public company. So to Vince, at the end of the day, I mean, Vince was going to do what he thought made money. And he would go with the guy and you could charm him. But as soon as it stopped making money, Vince was going to make a change. In WCW, because they had this big company behind them, there was this feeling they were kind of fleecing the big parent company because there was nobody there going like, you have to make money right now. So everybody just kind of grabbed for what they had, and yeah, that's what happened.
You talked about Bret Hart kind of serving that special enforcer role. He's also the guest ref of the Eric Bischoff-Larry Zbyszko match on this show. Bret, of course, Montreal the month before, had just made the jump. What do you remember, Dave, about the buzz at this particular point in time as to how Bret Hart was going to be used? Did they have grandiose, specific plans for him at this point in time? And, was it thought that he'd be playing a more major role than he ended up playing out of the gate in WCW?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was he was going to come in and they were going to do exactly what they did with Sting. They were going to build for a whole year, and then he was going to work with Hogan at the end of the year at the next Starrcade, and they never got near that. I think that there were just the Brett thing. There was just all kinds of issues. I think that Brett never had his heart into it because I think that Brett very quickly on didn't believe that they were as organized and they knew what they were doing as compared to WWF. And I think that mentally got to him. I think he worked with Flair and the powers that be, were upset in the sense that they paid all that money for Brett, and half the audience was cheering Flair, but when Flair was a heel, half the audience was cheering him against Hogan too. But it just, for whatever reason, but Brett had no allies. I mean, I think that's what the thing was. Brett was making a lot of money, but he had no allies. I think that there were a lot of people there that resented how much money he was making, maybe like a Savage and people like that, because of the feeling that they thought that they were bigger stars than he was, and he was getting all this money. And even Hogan, to a degree, was like, even though Hogan was making more than Brett, it was like, well, Hogan thought he was Hogan, and I don't think they thought Brett was deserving of that kind of money. Eric got it because he thought it was a big coup taking, one of the top guys from WWF at the time. But yeah, there were just a lot of things that were going on at the time. I can't say that there were points for a few weeks here and there where they did use Brett pretty well, but for the most part in that run there, I don't think they did, and I don't think they ever really had a clue what they were doing. And I mean, the key of that is why didn't they run house shows all throughout Canada?
Yeah.
Especially, the first time, I mean, they did run Montreal. I don't think they ever ran Calgary. I don't think they ever ran. No, they never ran Montreal. I take that back. Or maybe they did. They ran Montreal with Jacques, but that was the Jacques Rougeau show.
That was 97 earlier.
Right, before you even got there. No, they ran the big one in Toronto, and then they ran some shows in Western Canada. I think they did a couple of shows in Vancouver that did pretty well. The first one, anyway. But that was the extent of it. I don't think they ever ran Calgary. I don't think they ever ran Winnipeg. And even when they ran Toronto, there was so much weird fighting going on. I mean, that was just bizarre. I mean, like Hogan was trying to cut his throat in Toronto, something fierce. I mean, that story was when the whole thing came out. There's no mistaking that there were people, that did not want Brett to. I think that Brett was real hot coming off of that Montreal thing, and I think there were people really trying to make sure that momentum didn't stay, and that Brett became just one of the guys, which was too bad because they were paying him so darn much money to be just one of the guys.
I've been following wrestling for almost my entire life and trying to understand the psychology behind some of the locker room manipulations. And you spent a lifetime trying to figure out the impossible. And sometimes, why would anybody in WCW see it in their interest to not allow Bret Hart to be a centerpiece star? How did that serve anybody in the locker room?
I think, well, I mean, if you're looking at all of the other guys that all thought that they, that were all battling for the same position, they thought that if they made sure, and he wasn't running in there, Brett wasn't so emotionally in the idea of, he wasn't pushing for it like the other guys were pushing for him not to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another part of it. Brett was kind of detached. He would come in and do his work, and then he would leave. And while the other guys were out there doing their manipulations. So it was, they were all kind of, I think that they would try to push the idea, he really wasn't that big of a star in WWF after, they paid all that money for him. And, I just think it was resentment of, I think that there was the resentment and the feeling that if we moved him out, well, that's, I mean, you got a bunch of guys that were all fighting for spots is what it was.
Yeah.
And guarding.
And the spots were that finite that you couldn't let Brett have a seat at the table. It really threatened. Folks felt that it really threatened their position that much if there was someone else at the table.
They were all threatened by everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone was manipulating for everyone. For them, everyone was manipulating for themselves, and they were manipulating for their friends.
Mm-hmm.
And Brett didn't have the right allies. That's really what it came down to. I mean, I think Eric Bischoff was really behind Brett, but everybody in Eric Bischoff's ear wasn't behind Brett.
Right.
And they kind of manipulated Eric Bischoff to thinking that, oh, he's not really over, he's not really over, or whatever it was. He's
Hmm.
not really dedicated. He's this, he's that. Whatever, oh, like, look, they didn't cheer him against Flair that much. And it's like, yeah, you could say that about every single person in the company. And then, once then they would do those stop start pushes. And once you start doing a couple stop start pushes and the people don't, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
You're going to negate a lot when you do that because, the fans realized, I think the fans realized at some point pretty quick that they weren't fully behind him like they were with Sting. But again, with Sting, Sting wasn't out there doing matches all the time, and Hogan was they were all selling for Sting and everything because that was the big Starrcade match for Hogan. But in the end, Hogan screwed that up too.
Now, there was some talk at this point in time because of how red hot the Montreal story was, and having Brett come in at the same time that Wrestling with Shadows was ready to come out and all of that, that there were actually negotiations, right, Dave, to premiere Wrestling with Shadows on TNT, and Vince McMahon went to court to stop it. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes. He wouldn't allow it on any of those stations, so it ended up being on, I believe, it was A&E, right?
Yes, it was A&E.
Yeah.
They had aired Unreal Story of Pro Wrestling, and then they did the Andre one, and so they kind of got real interested. The Owen one aired on A&E as well.
Yeah, those
Um,
were late. Those were later. But the original, the
hmm
Wrestling Shadows aired on it aired on A&E, and the other part was when that came, and that did a really it did a really good rating, and the decision was made when that aired to keep him off television because at the time he was a heel and the movie made him a babyface. They
Oh,
figured if we put him on TV after the movie airs, he'll be a babyface, but they decided they wanted him as a heel when the movie aired. He should have come out and been a top babyface. The movie itself made him a babyface, so it was another example of, and that was at that point, like, very clearly they didn't want him as a babyface.
mhm.
Whatever it was, I mean, because if you remember, they turned him away too quick when the Owen thing happened, and he had all that sympathy when Owen came out. They were sitting there just waiting to turn him heel again because they just thought, and it's like you got to go with the guy as a babyface at this point. His brother just died, it was,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
it's almost like they purposely didn't have their ear to the ground when it came to Brett and the opportunities that organically presented themselves to highlight him. They almost purposely looked the other way, in the Wrestling with Shadows thing and not following up on that. I mean, talk about having something handed to you. And they just weren't interested from the beginning, really, it didn't seem like. Um,
yeah.
Here at Starrcade, we see Goldberg for the first time here in 1997. He works Mongo McMichael. It's an ugly affair. And talk about Goldberg at this point in time. He's at a much different place a year from now at Starrcade 98, but here, still very rough around the edges, but, star quality showing through. Your memories of the first few months of Goldberg in WCW.
Well, at the beginning, it was just some guy that they gave quick wins to that, I don't think that they ever understood how big he was going to get. No one did. It just was one of those things that, like it happens in entertainment. Something, there's something there, and then the public decides that they just want him, and so they decide that they want him. And to give them credit, unlike say WWE with Daniel Bryan or CM Punk, they went all the way with it. And the key, I think, was the winning streak idea. And I think that really built on itself, and I think that was a huge success. The problem with the winning streak was I don't think anyone understood this, but what made the winning, because I just remember like they would do, the winning streak was the number was legit, and then when the number became not legit, you could see the people turn on it, and they didn't understand. That's another one. They didn't understand what they had. They had for those 5 minutes that Bill Goldberg would be on during Nitro, people would like flock to turn the channels to watch Bill Goldberg, and to them it was just like this monster, Mike Tyson-esque. I mean, the whole thing, his gimmick was essentially being an MMA fighter anyway, but it was that type of a guy who was going to win quick and dynamic with the spear and the jackhammer. That's all they wanted to do is see that once every week, and he didn't need to talk. He was over more without talking. They just kind of lucked into something with this momentum, and then they made him another fake wrestler. And as soon as they did that, the edge was off. And that was they didn't understand why it worked, because it was a fluke that it worked. It wasn't like they set from day one they go, hey, look at this guy, we've got this long-term plan for him. It's like they just they had him win quick because he was kind of green, and the winning quick just got over. And once it got over, they did then go all the way with it. But like if you look at most of his wins, I mean, like you would see like a Raven and a Kurt Hennig and people like that. But a lot of those wins were against Jerry Flynn and people like that as well, and it didn't matter. They just wanted to see that Bill Goldberg spear and jackhammer. And it was just something that hit really big for a year, 1998, and really after 1998, I mean, he was still a star throughout until WCW went down, but the edge was really off of him after the end of 1998, after he had the first loss.
At Starrcade 97, we also see another sign, which, didn't seem severe at the time, but in retrospect is kind of universally regarded as a misstep. As the NWO gets so significantly watered down in terms of folks being added to the stable, wearing the black and white on this particular show just a year after they felt so hot and fresh, you've got Virgil, you've got Scott Norton, Buff Bagwell's in the stable, Michael Wall Street had been added. It's just being expanded when no one is calling for this. Dave, how much did this have to do with the fact that Eric Bischoff was committed to this philosophy that somehow the NWO could exist as its own promotion and its own television show just as much as a heel stable under the WCW banner? Because with that idea in mind, I can see why he felt he needed to, quote, build up an NWO roster. But not only did that end up not happening, it was a disaster of an idea in the first place, and it hurt the NWO.
Yeah, without a doubt. But I mean, the idea really was to have an NWO television show and to try to make the NWO into a separate promotion. Once they did 1 hour of Nitro as a test,
yep.
And they did that one pay-per-view as a test, and they were both disasters, so they never went any further with it. But that's why they had to add all those people, because if you were going to do a separate television show, you needed 20 guys or something like that. But that made no sense because you'd have to have the NWO wrestle each other or do nothing but squash matches where the NWO would be jobbers, neither of which was going to work. I mean, that whole idea of them, that separate NWO thing, it's like, I mean, I remember when it was like discussed with, before it ever happened, and I just like this can't work. I mean, it just, it's a heel group running a television show. It's like it's not the right dynamic to work.
Why do you think it even appealed to Eric Bischoff in the first place?
Well, I mean, they were selling a lot of merchandise, and it was a cool thing, and who knows who was in his ear, and I mean, I don't know how much Eric really understood. I don't think Eric really understood wrestling fans at all. I mean, not even though he had some great success, and I think that he, he's a smart guy, but there was something. What? I mean, if he understood wrestling fans well, he wouldn't have made the mistakes that he made all the way through.
Yeah.
But I think that he did come up with like some great ideas, and he did have Hulk Hogan and Savage and these guys when they still, again, it's like they were early 40s. They weren't that old. They were really mega stars that Vince had kind of, thought were too old when they still had another run left. So he got a lot of juice out of that. He had he had a great talent roster. He had the idea of Nitro, and as the new fresh thing was a great idea. So I mean, he had some good ideas, but in the end, I don't think I think that helped and it grew everything. But at the end, I don't think he really understood what wrestling fans wanted to see on a wrestling show, because there were so many mistakes made, and the thing went down so quick. Once the NWO kind of cooled down, I mean, it wasn't like this thing was like WWF right now, where you're on this kind of like a slow decline, for years, but it's still like pretty strong. I mean, WWF never nosedived, and these guys nosedived, and I mean, when in the year they nosedived, they produced like legitimately some of the worst television I've ever seen in wrestling.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They take the cake, I think, all time on that. One of the things about this show that's kind of weird that I always wondered about is they, to have that show closing scene of the whole WCW locker room hoisting Sting on their shoulders with the belt, they flew in basically the whole roster to the MCI Center. And the weirdest thing to me, Dave, is that for a lot of them, it wasn't enough that they were in the building for that scene. They made them sit with the people in the audience. You might remember this. They're sitting along the aisleway. Ray's there. James Vandenberg's there. I remember Mortis was there. Alex Wright. Did these guys really have to show up and sit there the whole show and pretend to be spectators for 3 hours?
That's I mean, they had a concept of what they were trying to accomplish. I mean, you didn't have to do it, but I wasn't against it. I thought the idea was strong. The
Yeah.
only thing, like I said, it needed to be and then the same thing with Bill Goldberg Hogan match that next summer. They needed to be a substantial change because when you had the babyface finally overcame and got the big win, everything ended up the same anyway. And it's like at that point, it's like, wait a minute, this whole thing we're hoping for change didn't happen, even when we got what we wanted. And then it's kind of like that was going to be a big turnoff. Like I said, the Sting thing would have been a lot worse in the long run had Bill Goldberg not come along, because they would have gone down a lot quicker. I remember February of '98, knowing they were, and this is when they were still very strong, super strong as a matter of fact. But February '98 was when I figured that what, they're going down, and and I thought it was going to be quicker, but then I didn't realize how big Goldberg got. And then with Goldberg, I thought they had a real chance to not go down. And then really it was the next year Starrcade, and when that was over, it was like, yeah, and WWF had already overtaken them by then anyway, and they had just kind of like started self-destructing, but the beating of Goldberg wasn't the how do I say it? It wasn't like this one thing destroyed the company, like some people would like to say. There were many, many, many things, but that was what? It wasn't even beating him. It was the follow up again. It's like the follow up of beating him. He needed to be really made strong afterwards, and instead he just kind of like was made to look like a goof, and never got the big wins that he needed to get after the loss. And yeah, it just really fell apart at that point.
And finally, on Starrcade '97, I'm sure you've thought about this, Dave, and we're asking listeners to sort of weigh in and take a stab at this as well. How should the NWO angle have ended? What should have been the point at which WCW triumphs and the NWO gets retired?
Yeah, it should have been a battle for the entire promotion. And at the end, WCW wins, and then you need some really good. And when you do that, you need some really good ideas to restart. To follow up with some new things. And that was the problem as well. They never did the blow off. At some point, you had to do the blow off again. When I remember talking to Bischoff, and we talked about this earlier. This was in '96, and he was hoping to get it till the end of the year, and I thought the end of '97. I thought it was that strong, but here you were in '98 and '99. You're still doing it, and by the end of '98, it was certainly weakening, and in '99, it was going down the tubes. So I think that perhaps obviously the end of '96 was way too early. The end of '97, I think, may have been a little early too, although that's when I would have targeted it. But the end of '98 was also too late. So whatever it was, maybe mid '98. You do the big blow off, and it's like, this is it. And then when it's done, it's done. You got to go somewhere else. Maybe then you turn Hogan babyface. I don't know, but you had to do the thing where the winner take all match, and it should have been the biggest match in the history of the company. Everything at stake, and where you would really go for that, whatever it is. I mean, they got buy rates up to 600. Maybe with the Sting match, and I think you could have gotten a lot bigger. I think the Hogan Goldberg match would have been a lot bigger. It had been promoted better. And with that, I think that's kind of like where you would go. But then again, you would start needing like a new set of programs or maybe Hogan has to move down at that point. I mean, because again, you weren't Hogan and Flair and Nash and Hall and those guys. Everything's got a shelf life. You can't keep regurgitating the same matches over and over and over again. And expect to stay hot. It's just not going to work that way. And you have to start building up the new guys. And they had all those good young guys. They need to let some of them break through, which they never did. That was another problem. I mean, they let DDP break through to a degree, but most of the guys on the roster that were on the way up, they kept getting their legs cut off. Brett was a perfect example. Brett should have revitalized that whole product. You got a superstar with, who came in hot, and instead, they didn't really come close to getting the value out of him that they should have gotten.